No accident, of course. Today is the 50th anniversary of the first time that a human being stepped on the moon, and we're very excited to have you here, very excited to share our new exhibit. How many people here actually remember the man first stepped on the moon? It's probably easier to ask who doesn't actually remember. I was about 6, but I do remember it. I wasn't on the Space Coast, but I was in Omaha, Nebraska, living off at Air Force Base because that's where my dad was stationed. And I remember they putting together this cardboard model of the lunar module that they had passed out to first graders. And but on the actual day, I don't think I had a real awareness of that's what was happening. But I was out riding my bike in what had to be the end of the day. And I noticed that in our neighborhood, which was usually very active, there was nobody out. So I stopped into a friend's house, and everybody was gathered around the TV, and I got there just in time to see the grainy black and white images coming from the moon. It was pretty exciting. But of course, it had a huge impact on the Space Coast, hence the name of our exhibit. That's where we got the name for the Space Coast. But it's an exciting exhibit. If you haven't seen it yet, we'll see it in a bit. But we have a great speaker here to tell us about that era. And I want to introduce you to the person responsible for putting the exhibit together. For those of you who haven't met her, I should say I'm Ben Brookmarkle, by the way. I'm Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society. We operate this museum. But the manager of the museum and our public history coordinator is Holly Baker, and you probably, if you haven't met her, you probably recognize her voice. And she is a regular contributor to our radio program, Florida Frontiers, as well. So, please welcome Holly Baker.
Thank you all so much. Well, hi, I'm Holly Baker. I'm the manager of this museum, and I love working here. And I appreciate that you're all here today for our exhibit opening. And we're just proud to be here. Today, of course, is the anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing, and my intern Emily Strickland and I put this exhibit together to commemorate that, and also to celebrate Brevard County's role in the remarkable achievement as well. So, along with the exhibit opening, as you can see, we have space-themed snacks and tang and whatnot, and we also have a music playlist, and we also have another special treat for you, and it's a presentation by space historian Dr. Amy Foster, who from the University of Central Florida, and I was lucky enough to take a couple of classes with her when I was going there. And
she did fine.
Thank you. I learned an awful lot about space history in her classes, and it actually sparked my interest in space history, to be honest. So that's another reason why I decided to put this exhibit together. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Amy Foster.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, so thank you for asking me. I'm going to talk, when you talk about the beginning of the space program and the beginning of the space race, and the Apollo program is kind of the end of what we consider the space race. There's a million topics that we could talk about. I've talked about plenty over the years, but I actually want to spend some time today talking about kind of the backside. I was actually trained as an engineer. Never practiced as an engineer, but I do, in fact, I have a t-shirt that says, yes, actually I am a rocket scientist. Because my degree is in aeronautical and astronautical engineering, and I specialized in non-air breathing engines, which means rockets. So I've always been fascinated by rockets, and then when no one was hiring engineers in the early 90s, it's like, well, what do I do with the rest of my life? And ended up kind of discovering that there was this field of the history of technology, which Holly has heard some about, and Emily has heard plenty about, because she was in my grad class this spring when we did the history of technology. And it was like this melding of two perfect things for me. I've always loved the space program. Basically, I wanted to be an astronaut, which is kind of what got me into engineering, but so there's that. Basically, this is something that I've always loved, and so it's been a lot of fun to create a career out of it and to be able to continue to talk about it. So I spend most of my research talking about the later periods, so we're getting into the space shuttle era. But this is when it all starts, and it doesn't happen without the space race. So, I mean, I could, like I say, talk about the beginning of the space race and how we end up getting to the moon, but there's some real technical questions about how to actually do this. I mean, the idea of getting to the moon is something that we've thought about for a long time, but it is, all right, so there you go. It's really because of this man that we go to the moon. So on May 25th, 1961, Kennedy is making a speech before Congress, and we all know this is when he says, you know, we're going to put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. And this basically starts what becomes the Apollo program. So plenty of you were around for Apollo. Who heard this speech? All right. What sense do you have of the space program when he made this speech?
We're losing.
Sputnik, yeah. And that's like it, right? Because that's, I mean, we've done one spectacular thing in space at this point when he makes this speech. Alan Shepard had flown in space. All right, barely. Barely flew in space. His flight lasted 15 minutes. He sat on the pad probably 20 times longer than he actually was in flight. All right, so this was a suborbital flight, and it has a lot to do with the fact that the rockets that we were using at that point were relatively small. And that's, I mean, this is lots more than I could need to talk about. But you know, the rockets that we were using at that point, we actually had some technological advantages over the Soviets. And one of those was in miniaturization. So we didn't need to build these massive rockets because we had the technology to build small things. And so we're working with small rockets. They are the successors of the German rockets used in World War II. So the Redstone rocket that Alan Shepard rode and the Redstone rocket that Gus Grissom rode are basically glorified V2 rockets. But they did the job. They got our first Americans into space, but suborbital flights. So it is with 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience that Kennedy makes this announcement. All right, and I as a historian, but also as a Democrat, I will proudly say this was the most bonehead decision a president ever made. Because 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. And we'll see a picture later of James Webb, who was the administrator at the time, and he knew that Kennedy was going to make this speech, but his response was, "Who wants my job?" Seriously, who wants my job? Because the technical elements of getting to the moon by the end of the decade, and so that at least gave us since the 1970, thank God, you know, because are extraordinary, given the fact that the best we had at this point was a suborbital flight. So we've got to get from a suborbital flight to the moon by the end of 1970. So this was an extraordinary task, but this is really what kind of gets the program started. Now the idea doesn't come out of nowhere. So if we could play this, and I think we don't have sound, but I'm going to try anyway. So this is actually from the day that Sputnik launched. I don't know if we're going to get sound or not. Probably not. So what you would be hearing, and what you are seeing, is that's John Glenn. Yeah. All right? A young John Glenn. He is a major at this point in the U.S. Marine Corps. He's on Name That Tune. With Eddie Hodges, the child actor Eddie Hodges. And basically, you know, the host is asking Glenn, well, you know, what do you think about this whole Sputnik thing? And he's like, well, you know, it's really fantastic that the Soviets were doing this. This is a benefit for science. Wonderful thing, you know, and maybe, and as he says here, and maybe in Eddie's lifetime, we'll see men walk on the moon. And Eddie Hodges is saying, no, I'm just fine right down here. That's pretty much where that is. So, yeah, since the audio is not going to work, we'll just leave it at that. But, you know, the idea is out there. But the real question is, you know, how do we get from Kennedy making, as I say, that bonehead decision to the moon? And we've got to go farther back in terms of where the ideas come. So in 1957, when John Glenn is on Name That Tune, NASA doesn't exist yet. NASA isn't formed until 1958. So Eisenhower, in the following spring, after Sputnik launches, and then after we successfully launch our Explorer satellite, Eisenhower is going to create NASA, which is officially going to be formed in October of 1958. So we don't have NASA at this point, but we do have people thinking about going to the moon. And they're thinking about going to the moon because there's a very long history of thinking about going to the moon. And it goes back very much in terms of formulating these ideas in the 19th century. So the first person to lovingly put this into words was Jules Verne. And he writes this first book that's about going to the moon called From the Earth to the Moon, which is the same name that ends up for the miniseries that HBO did that focused on the early space race and the Apollo program. Good series if you haven't seen it. It's been a while now, but it's still available. So he writes this book, and it's basically set in 1865 in the United States, and the idea is at the end of the American Civil War, the Baltimore Gun Company pulls out this huge cannon and put a capsule on top and fire it to the moon. And so these early ideas of how do we get there really come from science fiction. Now, we don't stop with Jules Verne. It goes on. So I put this in there. You recognize this? Yes. All right. No one was around for this, I'm sure. All right. Good. All right. Because this is December 17th, 1903. And I put this in here. Basically, this is the Wright brothers flying for the first time. One of the few photographs of their 4 flights on December 17th. The longest one lasted a little bit over a minute. But what they proved on that day was flight was possible. Controlled, powered, manned flight. It's not practical yet, but it's possible. All right, so we've been flying gliders up to this point, but this is the first time that all of those elements had been put together and something was successful. But in 1903, there were plenty of scientists and engineers who still didn't think human flight was possible. So, we're getting into an age where you still have these dreams of going to the moon are still very much science fiction, but you have people paying attention and they're starting to be inspired by some of these ideas. So the next big kind of science fiction thing that made a big impact was a movie called Frau am Mond, so it's a German movie made by Fritz Lang. And there were 2 people who actually were a consultant on this film. So one of them was Willy Ley. He ends up coming to the United States in 1935. As the Nazis were getting into power, he's like, oh, this is a bad scene. So he got out. But he worked as a technical advisor on this film, as well as a man named Hermann Oberth, who ended up working with the Germans during World War II to develop their V-2 rockets. So both of these men have a lot of rocket technology understanding and capabilities, as early as it was in 1929. So we do have some early rockets. Robert Goddard had been working on rockets in the United States. There had been theorists about rockets in Germany, in Russia, as well as the United States, who were all kind of coming up with these ideas. But this is basically the first time we get a film that suggests going to the moon. Now, one of the things that I will point out here is, even though, you look at the film and it's like, well, I don't know. One thing that you do kind of see in this clip is they get the idea that there's going to be increased gravity during launch, which is probably a little more than is actually the case. But hey, they're actors, so that's their job. But does this look like anything familiar?
Yeah, the shuttle.
Does look a little bit like the shuttle. What about the building? It looks a lot like the VAB, the Vehicle Assembly Building, which was built to put together those Apollo rockets. The Apollo rockets were large, very large, and you needed a big building to put these all together and stack them onto a pad that you can take out from the launch pad and launch these bad boys. So you know, we're starting to get these representations, and they are fueling these ideas of rocket scientists, to include 2 of them who were actually working on rockets at the time. And one of the other people who's actually reading and watching all of these is Wernher von Braun, who is going to be an essential character and contributor to the US space program after World War II when we bring them over, and a bunch of his engineers from the United States. So here is Wernher von Braun. So he comes over in 1945, basically as a captured engineer, along with about 100 of his team. And he is working, initially he's working out in White Sands, New Mexico with his scientists. They're deconstructing the V-2 rockets, they are building new sounding rockets. So they are the basis of the American space program in its infancy. And eventually they're going to move to Alabama and be taken over, they're going to enter into the Army, but that's going to take a little bit of time. So for the 40s and 50s, von Braun is still working on rockets, and he's trying to promote the idea of spaceflight. This was his big dream. You know, he's a complicated character. He does have a history during World War II. He was a member of the Nazi Party, but mostly so that he could get money to build his rockets. But it still means, you know, he's accepting that philosophy, and so he's a complicated individual. With a complicated past, and it was something that Eisenhower was very aware of when he created NASA. He wanted to distance himself at least from that political past as much as anything, which is why NASA is a scientific organization and not a military organization. Eisenhower did that on purpose. But von Braun is a major part of this, and he's promoting the idea of spaceflight. And a lot of this is inspired from what he read as a child and young man and what he saw in films. He's using these ideas and building off of them. And to say this isn't in any way just an individualist kind of situation. If you talk to engineers and scientists and astronauts, they all read and watched science fiction and were inspired by it. I was a fellow at the National Air and Space Museum for a year, and Eileen Collins came and introduced 2 actors from the series Stargate. And basically her introduction was, you know, not you 2 guys, but I watched science fiction growing up, and that's what inspired me to do what I do. So science fiction and science fact are really closely tied together, and so that's really important in part of the story. Where do we get these ideas about going to space? So Wernher von Braun was using science fiction very much as a tool, but he's also using popular culture as a way to kind of get these ideas out. So Chesley Bonestell, excuse me, was an illustrator, and I don't have a picture of him, but I have pictures of his work. So Bonestell and von Braun are actually going to start working together to promote this idea of spaceflight. And so there's actually 3 different books that they worked on together. So this is one of Bonestell's drawings, and it's basically still a V-2 rocket because it's 1948, and that's kind of what we're limited to. But already putting the idea out there that we could go to the moon. So this was a project that Bonestell and von Braun did together to start promoting these ideas. And between 1952 and 1956, they worked on these 3 books in particular. But there's something else that they started working on together. Oh, yeah. This is actually a drawing from one of those books, and it's basically 3 proposed lunar landers. None of them are quite what we ended up with, but they're already putting ideas out there that are in fact fairly scientifically grounded for the era. Again, this is 1953, I think, when that book came out. So, you know, it is what it is. But they partner together to get these ideas out there into the public. And they do that with Colliers Magazine. So Colliers Magazine was a fairly widely read magazine. It was a popular magazine in the 1950s. And they did a series of articles, 8 different articles, that were published in this magazine. And this particular issue that came out in October 1950, look at my notes, I think it's 52. Yep, October 18th, 1952. So the drawing on the cover is Bonestell's drawing. This one is actually von Braun's drawing. Not quite as good, so you can see why you got an illustrator. But this idea, this was von Braun's idea for a lunar lander. And it's complicated. And it's messy. And if there's one thing you notice, it's big. So, you know, the lander that we end up with in Apollo is 20 feet tallish. It's lanky. It's got lots of little arms sticking out. It's good. It's actually, it is the most spacecraft that you could ever actually design, because it didn't have to fly in an atmosphere, so you could make it light, you could make it gangly, and you didn't have to worry about anything burning up, because it's not going to do that in a non-moon atmosphere. So they built the lander to be single purpose, and as light as they possibly could. But with this, it is in fact huge. It stands 110 feet tall? No, 160 feet tall, which is taller than the Statue of Liberty by 9 feet. It is 110 feet wide, too big. All of these little pods, so this is actually like the habitat. These are fuel tanks. There's 18 of them. Gangly and dangerous as all get out. It carries about 800,000 pounds of hydrogen fuel. This is basically a bomb on spindly legs. There are 4 outer ones that are gray. Those are actually 33 feet in diameter. Yeah, bigger than this room. Yeah, pretty much. Those at least can be dumped, and those are carrying almost 3/4 of the fuel. But yeah, it's an idea. It's out there. But we're putting these ideas out there, and it's getting the general public interested and excited about the possibilities of what's out there. Because you can have scientists working on this all day, but unless you can get the people behind the idea, it's going to sit on the ground. But von Braun and Bonestell were working on this, and when they start putting this out into the general public, somebody else gets interested. Walt Disney. So Walt Disney and von Braun get together and make 3 episodes that will air on Wonderful World of Disney. You can buy copies of for yourself. I have them. They're corny, because they were done in the 50s. 1955 is when these came out. But basically, so it brings von Braun with these ideas together. And I've got another picture, but this is actually an early concept of the shuttle that von Braun was promoting in 1955. So these ideas are there. It's just a matter of getting them built. So this is actually a couple of images from the production for this Man in Space. I should have italicized man. There's the editor in me. So they're basically working on them as famous animators go. Well, you've got Walt here. This is Walt Kimball, who did a lot of lead animation for Disney. There he is again. And they're working on basically these mock-ups that were going to be part of the Man in Space series or episodes. These were wildly popular. So it's getting the idea out there. All right. So yeah, so von Braun did participate in the filming. He would do some intros to the episodes, and then you'd have those films that look kind of a lot like Frau and Mond. You know, kind of. This is what we envision spaceflight will be like. But this is, in fact, this shuttle mock-up. It's built on a design of 4 stages, which is a little too much Basically, by the time you get to 4 stages, it's almost not economically viable to do a 4th stage, just kind of stick to 3. But the idea is you have all of these drop off, and this flies back to space, and it's reusable. So he's putting this idea out there very, very early, and getting the people behind him. All right.
After all, it's taxes that pay for this.
It is taxes that pay for this. Not as much as you think. The budget for NASA is, well, it is our taxes, but when you start looking at what the NASA budget represents, it's pretty minimal of the federal budget. The highest it ever was in like 1966, and it was 4.5% of the federal budget. The highest, and then it started dropping off. It was the highest in recent years under George Bush. And then there was a little peak again with Clinton, and now it's kind of dropped off again. So we're kind of hovering around 0.5%. That's what NASA works on. And what they're doing is some pretty extraordinary things. But the question was, how do we actually get to the moon? So these ideas are floating around. Von Braun's certainly been thinking about them. But now how do you pull it off? So Kennedy has given NASA this call. Get to the moon. Now how do you do it? So there were 3 ideas. And this is really why I wanted to talk about this, because I don't think people really know kind of some of the controversy that was going on within NASA about how we were going to actually pull this off. So one of the things that I like to point out, again, about where NASA was at in terms of getting to the moon. So when the Mercury program ended, Gordon Cooper was the last person to fly in 1963. So now we got 7 years to get to the moon. All right. This flight lasted about 25 hours. There were 2 systems that were still really running in his capsule. Life support and the clock. Because the batteries were dying. How long does it take to get to the moon? When did we celebrate the launch, the 50th anniversary of the launch? Tuesday. Tuesday was the anniversary of the launch. And they're walking on the moon on Saturday. And they still have to get back. 3 days. It really takes 3 days to get to the moon. Get there.
And back.
And now you gotta get back. And those batteries were lasting 25 hours. The battery technology. I mean, that's just one of the simple things that NASA had to figure out to get to the moon. Which, helps you kind of understand why Jim Webb was going, "Who wants my job?" Because, oh my God. There was a lot to figure out. And so there were 3 plans that were kind of bandied around. And this is kind of in order of popularity. So there's direct descent. I'll talk about all these. Earth orbit rendezvous and lunar orbit rendezvous. Now, when you go back to what Jules Verne was promoting, it was this idea of direct descent. All right, so it is basically you launch a really big rocket from Earth, and you send it straight to the moon. It lands, and it comes back. All right. Pretty much everything we've launched since Gemini has had more than 1 stage. All right, and the reason for that is if you can put a lot of fuel to get that bad boy off the ground, and once you've burned all that superstructure that held that fuel, if you can drop it, that's a lot of weight you no longer have to carry. It's a lot of technology, it's a lot of engineering, it's a lot of electrical equipment, and it's a lot of really heavy things like engines that have to be built strong enough that they don't melt in those flames. Those are heavy, and if you can drop those away, great. Because for every pound of cargo, and when we're talking about cargo, we mean anything that you have to carry along with you. So that's all that superstructure, if you're taking all that along, you need 3 pounds of fuel. All right, 1 pound of cargo, 3 pounds of fuel. That's a lot of fuel, and fuel is heavy. So basically, this idea of direct descent was send something the size of a charter bus to the moon and back. And it has to have the fuel to get off the ground, get out of Earth's gravity, and then get back from the moon's gravity. And then brake so it doesn't slam back into the Earth. Right? That's a lot of fuel to stop a charter bus. Now, actually, it was a little bit bigger than a charter bus because I'll have an image for you in a minute. Earth orbit rendezvous. This is what Wernher von Braun really wanted. This is everything that everyone had been paying attention to. It seems logical because it's what everyone had been thinking about since 1865. This is what von Braun wanted. So basically, you put smaller rockets into Earth orbit. So some will include what is eventually going to go to the moon. Some will include fuel that you need to get to the moon. All right. So you send up multiple stages. They dock. So rendezvous. Dock together. And this is more economical because now you're lifting less at one time. All right. You put those two together, you send those to the moon. That whole structure has to land. That's why he has these big models. These big things that are going to land, because you're still sending something fairly big. You've just put it together in space, as opposed to on the ground. That's got to land on the moon, either kind of like an airplane or kind of on its end. Now, we've seen SpaceX do this now, landing these boosters on barges, and that's amazing. But it's 2019. They're trying to do this in the 60s. So good luck. And you have to do it from 238,000 miles away. So there's that. So this is what von Braun wanted. And he wanted this for a very particular reason. Yes, it's cost savings. But how do you put all this together? Who puts all this together? People on a space station. He wanted a space station. In his mind, that was the next logical step. We get into space, and then we build a space station, and that serves as a port for travel beyond Earth orbit. So this was his favorite idea. Cost savings from this, so that seemed like a good idea. And then there's lunar orbit rendezvous, which is kind of a screwball idea that didn't have a lot of support, but basically it is, we'll send up little bits that will go to the moon, and you're cutting down all the costs. Now what it does mean, and this is what we end up with, you've got a command module, a service module, and a lunar module, and those are now going to have to dock together at the moon, 238,000 miles away. And that's what NASA didn't like about this idea. But this is what we're starting with. This was the NOVA rocket. This was originally what was proposed for direct ascent. So this is a Saturn V, essentially, even though it says C5, this is actually from 1962, so it didn't have all the designations yet. This is NOVA. So it's larger, a little bit taller, but huge. I mean, this is such a massive piece of machinery. And the idea is this whole thing goes to the moon. This whole thing. That's not really going to work. It's too expensive, and this rocket hadn't been built. So there's that. In 1962, this is still just an idea. But if you go back and you watch Kennedy's speeches, so he makes the announcement in May of 1961 that we're going to go to the moon. But between May and September of 1962, when he makes his speech at Rice University, which I think is the best one.
It's the best.
It's the best one. It's the one that says, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to do these things that are hard,
Not
Yes, we do
it's
them.
easy.
Yes, we do them. Well, it's this whole lead up, and it's why does Rice play Texas? We do these things. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Now, at that point, he's really trying to get the American people behind the idea that this is still a good thing to do. He's also actually proposing at that time that we might actually work with the Soviets to go to the moon. That obviously didn't happen. But he was kind of putting that out there. And I'll share a little secret with you. How long have I been talking? A lot. He actually wasn't a fan of the space program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He did it for political reasons. Yeah. The whole reason he announced that we were going to the moon because the Bay of Pigs had blown up in his face about a month before, and he needed a political win. So, you know, that was really his motivation. So as soon as the idea kind of catches on and you get some inspiration in the people, then he's like, oh, now we have to do this thing. So I have to keep the idea going. But this basically was the original idea. But in 1962, like I say, they haven't even gotten this thing built. They don't even have the Saturn V's built yet. So this is even where, you know, they're still contemplating, can we do something as big as Nova? But when you go back to those speeches, you will hear Kennedy talk about the Nova rocket. So it's something that was being put out there. So this was really the favorite program by Bob Gilruth. So he is the head of the Manned Space Flight Center, or Space Task Group, which is still actually based in Langley. Johnson Space Center hasn't been built yet. That's happening in this time period. And eventually, Bob Gilruth and his team are going to move to Houston, but they're still in Langley, Virginia. And this was his baby. He was really a big promoter of this. But if you can't get that rocket built, that's going to be a problem. So Earth Orbit Rendezvous, like I say, this was von Braun's baby because he wanted that space station. So here's the idea. You send a couple of things up in Earth orbit, put them all together, and then you only have to send this smaller piece, but you only have to you take the fuel that it's going to need for this part of the trip up in the second stage. So it's lighter. What Gilruth didn't like about this is we have to be able to rendezvous. We have to be able to dock. And so when you start looking at what Mercury program did and then Gemini program did, what Gemini was all about was proving that we had the skills that we needed to make these things work. So one of the big things that was happening during Gemini was rendezvous and docking. That was a big part of it. Also learning how to walk in space, that was a challenge. It was a real challenge. But just basically getting these skills together. So like I said, this is what von Braun wanted because he wanted that space station. He is now in Huntsville, Alabama, at the Marshall Space Flight Center. That move happens in 1959, I believe. So he's been incorporated into the space program, and he's a powerful voice in this program. Then you have the idea that nobody wanted. This is John Holt. He's an engineer working at Langley, and he was one of the people who started promoting this idea of lunar orbit rendezvous. It's not a new idea, clearly. It's first proposed in 1916 by a Russian. So there's actually a lot of Russian early scientists who are thinking about spaceflight in this period, 1910, 1920. They're thinking about a lot of these things. The whole idea of staging a rocket comes from Konstantin Tsiolkovsky out of Russia. So the ideas were there, and basically Holt was bringing the idea back. So he introduces this idea with 3 of his colleagues to the Space Task Group in early 1961, and they went, there's no way we're doing this, because we still have that challenge of rendezvous. We like the idea that it's cheaper, but now we have to do this rendezvous around the moon, 238,000 miles away. And if anything goes wrong, we can't get those astronauts back. If it goes wrong in Earth orbit, we can get them back, but we can't do anything if they're around the moon. Right? So this idea gets shot down pretty quickly. Now Humboldt's not willing to give up, because he knows, in terms of technological capability, this is what we have the best chance at. So he's dogged. So for 10 months, he keeps kind of pushing this idea through regular channels, that this is the best way to go. Now, what's working in his favor is direct ascent is falling apart. They have not gotten anything near a NOAA rocket working. Earth orbit rendezvous is having trouble because you still need that platform, and that's not coming together. So this is kind of what's left. This is Joe Shea down at the end. He's the director of the Manned Space Flight Systems Operations. And he's basically the one who's going to have some pull in all of this. He listened to some of those early presentations and wasn't so game with the idea. So Hobart goes above his head and goes above his head. And in November, so now 10 months after they made that initial presentation, he writes a 9-page letter to Bob Siemens, who is the associate administrator for NASA, only under this guy, James Webb, who said, "Who wants my job?" Seriously, who wants my job? That guy. So he's second in charge and writes this letter. And I have bits from this letter that I think are pretty telling about how passionate he was about this idea. He said, "Somewhere as a voice in the wilderness, do you want to go to the moon or not?" And it goes on. Why is Nova, with its ponderous size, simply just accepted, and why is a much less grandiose scheme involving rendezvous ostracized or put on the defensive? I fully realize that contacting you in this manner is somewhat unorthodox. He's lucky he didn't lose a job. But the issues at stake are crucial enough to us all that an unusual course is warranted. So Siemens sat with that letter for 2 weeks and wasn't really sure quite how to respond. He thought about it. He sat down with some other engineers. He started thinking this over. And then he went to Jim Webb and he said, "I think this is a good idea." But it took that long. So in April, Joe Shea is going to, so the guy in the end, who's basically going to make these manned spaceflight decisions, sits down and has this meeting with Jim Webb and all the center heads and says, "We need to go with LOR." And then now the only other person to get on board was Werner von Braun. All right. So in between here, they now sit down. Webb is on board. So now they go to von Braun and we're like, "Dude, this is a good idea." And this is the only one that's going to work. I mean, nothing else is going to get us to the moon by the end of the decade. So we have to give this a try. And I think this, from a technological standpoint, we can make this work. And we have the manpower to do it. And we have smart guys like Hobart who've got it figured out. So we just have to rely on them. So in July of 1962, James Webb will publicly make an announcement that LOR is what is going to get us to the moon. Now, kind of as a thank you, John Holt was in mission control when they landed on the moon. So these are a lot of signatures of the people who were there, and I think it's kind of fun. Apollo 11 is there. Someone, you can't actually see it, but where is it here? Someone's actually circled this screen and says Neil Armstrong there. Oh, there it is. Neil Armstrong, first step on the moon, right there. That circle. There's John Holt's signature. So that was the thank you he got. Was they acknowledged his contributions. So this is kind of my last slide, and I guess the point I really want to make about this decision-making process and everything that had to happen to make this work. Apollo is an extraordinary accomplishment. And even today, it would be an extraordinary accomplishment to go back. And they did this with the computing power of probably the solar calculator I used in the 1990s in college. A lot of slide rules. They had computers, but they're punch cards. And they took rooms, and they had the computing power of my solar calculator. It's extraordinary what we did, and I think you have to thank what these men did, and a few women, to make this happen. You have a question?
No, last Monday I went up to the Kennedy Space Center, and they now have the retired NASA people sit around and talk. And I talked to a guy who was in the electronic area, and he was testing transistors.
Yes.
And he had some young interns there from different colleges in Florida. And they were just kind of looking at him like, "You gotta be kidding me." And I was kind of looking at him like, "You gotta be kidding me."
Yeah, it really is extraordinary what we did in 1969. I mean, just the technological leaps and bounds that we've made since then. You know, in 1969, we still didn't have personal computers.
Yeah.
You know, that's going to take another 9 years. And then there's still kind of blocks, unless you knew what you were doing. And you're building these things. You don't even have a display yet. That's the early 80s. You know, it's absolutely mind-boggling. And I think Emily's heard this, and probably Holly has too. When you look at the 20th century, we made more technological advance in that 100 years than we had in all of human history before then. And so, and that's partly why this is possible, but it is extraordinary what they did with what they had.
And if you look at their budget, in terms of research and development, what they got out of that, and then when they all broke up and went off, if other companies had to do that research and development, and the United States had funded those companies, it probably would have cost much more.
Probably. You know, this is, I think one of the things that makes the 20th century as prolific as it was is the 20th century is one of the first times that we're getting really organized federal support for science and technology. Again, Emily knows. We have it in the early 19th century, but in little pockets. It's in the armory system. And what the armory system is able to do with federal money is make interchangeable parts possible. No one else could do it before because it is an expensive proposition to develop machines that produce parts that are identical to make interchangeable parts possible. That doesn't happen without federal money where you can get behind it. But the 20th century is the century of big science and big technology because the government can and has decided to do that.
What was the relationship between NASA and all of the various subcontractors? Because that seems like a complicated relationship too in such a short time to get all these bids, accept proposals, and then
It's crazy.
It's NASA. We're just coming up with ideas, right? And then
yeah. So I mean, they're doing a little bit of the work themselves. You know, they're doing a lot of the R&D. So what's mostly happening at Langley, and I don't have a picture in the slides, but I've got a picture of it somewhere. As they're working on these designs, and the rockets are really coming out of Marshall Space Flight Center. So those engineers are working on it, but they have this tiny little picture of a model of a Saturn V rocket in a wind tunnel at Langley. So, you know, what NASA is, I mean, it's the follow-on to the NACA, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which was founded in 1917 to promote aeronautical research. And so a lot of what they're doing, you start having these NACA centers that are doing these research, but they're also funneling money to universities and they're funneling money to new companies to do this work, to work together, just because it's a task that no one small group can do. So certainly, you know, we've got the rockets themselves that are, they're NASA products. The command module was built by McDonnell. The lunar lander is built by Grumman. And so all of these people have to talk to each other, and that's challenging. And part of the reason we see the Apollo 1 fire happen is because there were so many changes that were being made. They're getting documented, but they're not getting transferred very well. So there's stacks and stacks of product changes, you know, memos about product changes. But how do you get them to each other, you know, and make sure everybody who needs to know needs to know. You can't send it over email, yeah, which would save time, but then emails get lost, and I mean, it's...
And they exist.
No, they don't exist, and they really don't exist in baby forms for the general public, at least. I mean, I had them in college, but baby forms. So the 90s. So yeah, it was a group effort. but a tricky one, because so many things are happening, so many changes, small changes sometimes are being made and are getting missed. And that's, again, when we start to look at the success of this project, it's still mind-boggling. Yeah.
And the other thing is the decision-making that they would have, what way are you gonna go with?
Mm-hmm.
Because they made a decision that they weren't going to do it completely computerized, that they were gonna let the people decide, and then the people would tell the computer to do it.
Yeah.
And they, like he's talking about the contracting, they would put bids out like for the rover, and they didn't even know what they were gonna have to land on.
No.
And so they would go and then try to look for the best idea, and some little small company, some guy somewhere would have a much better idea.
The best idea that meets the possible unknowns that we know of.
Yeah, that we know of.
I mean, my God.
And the rover, they had 18 months to come up with that.
And it folds up, and it fits inside.
Oh, it's so
it's amazing. It's amazing.
Just filling your chronology here, you're talking about Russian thinking about getting to the moon in 1917. My question is, how much does Robert Goddard, you mentioned him, fit into this chronology of importance? I mean, how could they picture a rocket being powerful before that?
So, I mean, Goddard's an interesting character. He does some cutting-edge work with liquid fuel rockets. They're small, but he's. I think if a psychologist sat down with him today, they would probably diagnose him somehow. He was paranoid. He didn't share a lot of his research. I think the person who ended up being closest to him was Charles Lindbergh, because they kind of knew what that spectator eye was like. He just didn't share a lot of his work, but the basics are there. You know, there's not a lot that, I mean, I like to tell my students that Holly knows this. So he moves from Boston, Massachusetts to Roswell, New Mexico to do this research. So, I mean, he's basically cutting himself off from the world because he's already paranoid about his ideas being stolen and his work being, you know, pilfered. And so in the 20s, there's, I mean, once he kind of stops his work and he's so private about it, we just don't get a lot of that. It just doesn't get out. And then once World War II happens, we're not really working on rockets during World War II. So the advantage that we get is we have these German rocketeers who have continued to work through the 20s. What they were doing, I mean, Goddard's work is as good as what they were doing in the 20s. It just, they shared. So he's a big piece, he's an important piece. But we just, as a country, we don't make the transition with his work very well. But when you start looking at kind of the levels of progression and progress, what Goddard was doing, what the Germans were doing, and what the Russians and then Soviets were doing, we were doing a lot. We were kind of keeping pace with each other. We did pretty well. Kind of an interesting piece about this that I didn't talk about, we had this competing program idea that got resolved by, 1962. Soviets were still fighting about 2 different moon programs in 1966. And that's part of the reason they don't get to the moon, is they're actually funding 2 rocket developments, and then their chief designer dies and the leadership goes away. They have internal fighting over whose plan is going to get promoted. The less developed plan ended up actually getting more money thrown at it because one of the engineers, the junior engineers working on that project, was Sergei Khrushchev, the son of Nikita Khrushchev. For them, it ended up being kind of a lack of decision. Yeah.
Do you happen to remember how that chief scientist died?
Yeah,
It's an interesting
so
story.
it actually was complications after what should have been a fairly simple surgery. I think it was jaw, it was thorax area. But he had spent years in the gulags and had a lot of physical damage and health issues because of that, and he just didn't survive the surgery.
The other guy that I was thinking of was one of their propulsion type people.
Oh, but he blew up.
He blew up.
Yeah.
He had thought that mixing liquid nitrogen or liquid oxygen and kerosene ahead of time would simplify the pumping system. Well, actually.
Well, sure, it does. As long as you don't get a spark somewhere until like the ignition.
Well, the thing that was kind of humorous in the story I was watching is that he was so convinced that this would work well that he took a chair and went right up to the edge of the blast zone on the pad. And then, of course, all of his team had to go there because they couldn't be shown up by the boss. And it blew up.
Yeah. I think that's the one they had like 102 deaths.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we had a very large help.
We did. Largely because, yeah, Sergei Korolev died. It's, you know, if we could play what if as historians, that's a great what if. I don't know, if he had survived that surgery, what if?
When did they consider, or when did the Russians consider, or when do you consider the Russian lunar program to be dead? Was it through the 70s? And
yeah, it's in the 70s.
So was Mir then was that their focus to kind of make, like, they were made a couple for that sort of, to try to get ahead on that?
They kind of keep their program, the idea of a moon program going until about 1972. And then they're just like, it's not worth it. Yeah, it's really not worth it. Let's do other things. And so, yeah, Mir is a little bit later, but they start putting up like temporary space stations as early as 1972. A series of them, salutes. And yeah, I mean, everything that we learned in terms of building the International Space Station, we got so much benefit from the experience they had, the 30 years of experience that they had with space stations. Yeah. So we weren't going to beat them on that. I'm going to go here and then back there.
In the clip from 25, there were stages apparently. When was that first conceived?
So that's Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. It's really like in the early 1900s. You can see his drawings. I mean, he's mapped it all out and he's done the map.
Is he the first guy to
Yeah,
come up with
yeah, and basically said anything more than 4 stages isn't worth your effort. So yeah, the idea of staging is that old. Yeah.
Well, it's based on math, and math has been around a while.
Right. Yes, it has. And what an engineer will do, so engineering is not about a perfect formula. You write out a formula and you go, okay, well I've got 5 different elements to this formula. These last 2, that adds 0.2%, and that adds 0.002%. We don't need those. That's too much work. So it all depends on how tight your tolerances are. So if you're building a road, you've got a lot more tolerance. If you're building, something that's got to get to the moon back, you might need that, at least that 4th element of your equation. But it's all about just how much work do we need to do with the math to get the tightest tolerances that we want. But I mean, yeah, Tsiolkovsky had it figured out. It's like 1904.
Like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Man.
And he was deaf.
Wow.
Yeah. So maybe he had the time. He wasn't distracted out of it.
I just wanted to point out that our friend George Mikos was one of the rocket scientists on the program.
How'd I do?
And he helped design and test the spacesuits.
Nice. Those are fun. Yeah, I've got a friend at the Smithsonian who's the curator of all the suits.
One thing to point out, the LEM had 2 guidance computers. The primary was by MIT. The second was the backup was TRW's.
Yeah.
And when I was working down in Houston, the MIT people kept sending memos and they wanted to change this, they wanted to change that, they wanted to change this. And our department had sent them a one-sentence letter that said, stop. Do not do anything.
Yeah.
And the flight crew actually used the backup system a lot.
Yeah, I know the astronauts spend a lot of time working with all of those systems, going, this isn't going to work, this isn't going to work, this isn't going to work, this works, we keep these and these, and we're not going to use those. Because they have, I mean, their lives are depending on it, and they have to be able to use it.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question about how much we did know about what progress the Russians were making, because today I watched a thing about, I'm not sure which Russian, because I got in the middle of it, which Russian astronaut tried to take do a spacewalk, and I guess something hideous really happened, and it was much more dangerous or certain things. And so when ours went out, they didn't have that knowledge, and they said in this thing that they would have made a little bit changes if they had had this knowledge of what had happened with the Russians.
We had one spacewalk that was...
The first one, they didn't give them any handles.
Right, and Ed White didn't do a whole lot. He didn't try to do a whole lot, but he did okay. The second one, I can't remember who it was now. He got so overheated. His visor fogged up, and he was so exhausted. I think it was Jim McDivitt was the commander. Wasn't sure he was going to be able to get him back inside. And so he's talking to Mission Control, and it's like, what do I do? If we can't get him back inside, what do I do? Because the option is we try to come back with the capsule door open and we both die, or I close the door on his hose and he dies and burns up on re-entry. And they struggled and struggled and struggled, and they got him back inside. And he dumped out like a liter of sweat out of each one of his boots when he got back inside. Wow. It was horrific.
And that's when they started doing it underwater.
Yeah, you've got to train for that. You've got to figure it out. And then, Buzz Aldrin comes along and just perfects the whole thing.
Was that because of the suit? The design of the suit itself?
He was the last one to do it. he was on Gemini 12, so yeah, he had the advantage of experience and training. Yeah, but it took about 4 spacewalks to really say, okay, I think we can do this. But figuring those things out, I mean, changing orbit didn't work the way they thought it was going to work. I mean, these are all pilots. And they're like, well, you pull back on the stick to go up. Nope, you pull back on the stick and you go down. And to catch something ahead of you, you have to slow down. It's like, what? It made no sense. It made no sense for pilots. So Gemini is all about that learning experience. And it took that long to get the Saturn rockets ready. We had Titan rockets. It's like, we got to get these guys up and practicing and figuring out, can we do all this? Yeah.
Eugene Cernan was the second spacewalker around.
Thank you.
Google. I met him. I met him.
Man, I should know that. I met 6 of the 12 men who walked on it.
Yeah.
Claims to fame.
Cool. Dr. Foster, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Before you leave the room, I just wanted to thank you all for being here today and for being a part of our exhibit opening and this special occasion. I'd like to say, feel free to take some food and beverage out of the room, and if you'd like to, we put some tables in the Ice Age room so you can spread out and enjoy that. And please check out the exhibit. Put a lot of heart and soul into it. I want to thank Emily again. Emily Strickland is my intern. She did a great job, so thank you.